Well, thank you very much, Sherry, and welcome everybody today. So today's session is on sensory processing and autism, and I'm just going to introduce it and just run through a few initial slides. So our presenters today are myself doing the introduction. So I'm Shelley Hughes. I'm the director for the therapeutics portfolio here at Pearson. That includes all our autism, sensory processing, occupational therapy, speech and language, and early childhood development products. I'm an OT by background, and I'm a registered OT in the US and in the UK. And as you can probably guess by my accent, I'm actually presenting from the UK today. Leading the main part of the presentation is my colleague, Melinda Cooper. Melinda Cooper is an occupational therapist as well, and she is based in Australia. And in the interests of fairness and the time of day it is, Melinda has pre-recorded most of her content or all of her content, and that will be a good chunk of today's session. Both Melinda and I are very much experts in the field of sensory processing. So, but Melinda's is a very engaging session, as I'm sure you will appreciate as you listen in. And then helping on the chat today, there'll be myself and then my colleagues, Liz Gross and Becky Whalen. Liz is a school psychologist by background and a senior assessment consultant and regional manager here at Pearson in the US. And Becky Whalen is an assessment consultant and speech and language pathologist in our US sales team as well. So we will be working feverishly through the chat as Melinda presents the content. Just to highlight a couple of other things. Disclosure, both Melinda and I work for Pearson Assessment. There's no other disclosure to mention. In terms of CEs, please make sure that obviously you are registered for this webinar. You have to be registered in order to receive the CEs. Webinar certificates will be emailed in approximately 3 weeks, as Sherry said, and that you must attend the full session, and we're only providing credit for 1 hour. And then learner outcomes. In the interest of time, I'm not going to read through all of these. You've got them in your handout packs, but I think they're fairly self-explanatory. And then here's an outline of the agenda. So we're going to talk a little bit about sensory processing and Dunn's sensory processing framework, which is very much a model that influences a lot of our thinking and intervention around sensory processing. Then we'll talk about sensory profile 2 and the adolescent adult sensory profile as 2 main tools used in this area. We'll talk about implications for participation and interventions, and then a really nice summary of some of the research that's really relevant. In terms of Q&A, as I said, we'll be answering these throughout the session. If we have time at the end, there might be time for 1 or 2. If there's a frequently asked question that's coming up a lot, then we'll try and fit that in. But we're also respectful of everybody's time today and try not to take this much over the hour. So on that note, I'm going to turn my camera off. I'm going to mute, and I'm going to move forward with Melinda's presentation. And please do ask us questions as we're going along.
Hi, everyone. Let's start with a brief introduction to sensory processing, and then we'll take a look at Dunn's sensory processing framework. I'm going to turn my camera off from now on, just so it's not distracting. Let's start by defining what we mean by sensory processing. We're talking about the process of gathering information via sensory receptors both within and outside our bodies, and organising it in the brain so that we can prepare a response. This is distinct from sensory integration, which also includes an adaptive response, and also air sensory integration, which is an intervention approach that requires specialised training. There's been a lot of research that shows a prevalence of sensory processing differences in autistic people, and we now have sensory hyper or hyporeactivity listed among the diagnostic criteria for autism in the DSM-5. Some of you may already be familiar with this quote by Winnie Dunn, who's the author of the sensory profile and a well-renowned expert in sensory processing. The experience of being human is embedded in the sensory events of everyday life. It's so true, and it just reminds us how fundamental sensory processing is to our everyday existence. Everything we experience in our lives, we do so through our senses. So knowing about a person's sensory processing patterns can help us understand a lot about why they respond the way they do in everyday situations. So speaking of Winnie Dunn, here is Dunn's sensory processing framework, which is based on many years of research, and it's been honed and refined over the years. It looks a little bit visually busy and confusing, so let's unpack it a little bit. You can see that there are two central yellow lines, so they form the axes or the skeleton of the framework. The vertical line represents the neurological threshold continuum. So there is a continuum from very high thresholds to very low thresholds. And the threshold is basically talking about how much sensory input is required to evoke a response or a noticing effect within the central nervous system. So if you're very high on that continuum, then you would need a lot more stimulation or a lot more intensity of stimulation to evoke that response. And then the lower down on the continuum you get, the less input would be required to evoke the same response. And you might be very quick to notice sensory stimuli, but very slow to habituate to them. So you might continue noticing them long after other people have stopped noticing them. Likewise, if with a high threshold, you might be slow to notice sensory information, or very quick to habituate to it. So your neurological threshold, where you are on that continuum, and everyone is on there somewhere because it's a continuum. Most people are in the middle, so there's nothing overly interesting about the way that they respond. Where you are on that continuum will talk about how responsive your central nervous system is to stimulation. But the horizontal axis, the self-regulation continuum, is really about what your behavior does as a result of those thresholds, and particularly what happens when your thresholds are not being met. So if you have very high thresholds, chances are a fair amount of the time you're being understimulated. You're not receiving enough sensory input from your environment to be enough to satisfy your sensory needs. And also then conversely, if you're at the lower end of the threshold, you're quite likely to be overstimulated often in situations that others don't find too stimulating. So if you're being over or understimulated, the way that you ultimately react to that will depend on where you sit on this horizontal axis or this self-regulation continuum, which again is a continuum anywhere from very passive on the left-hand side there. So you sort of allow sensory experiences to happen and you react to them, versus a more active or counteracting response at the right end of the continuum, which is where you would be actively seeking to maintain control over your environment and over the sensory input that is coming into your sensory system. So it's the combination of those two axes which will give us four potential pairs, which are the four quadrants in the model, and they're the ones that you can see in the green and pink writing or boxes. So if we have a combination of high threshold with a passive self-regulation or behavioral response, we end up with registration, also known as the bystander quadrant. High threshold with an active response is the seeking quadrant, known as seekers. Then moving down to the bottom half where we're talking about low thresholds, a low threshold with a passive self-regulation response gives us the sensitivity quadrant, or our sensors. And then low threshold with an active response is the avoiding or avoider quadrant. And all of these quadrants, you can have a score anywhere from similar to others through to much more than or much less than others. So everyone is somewhere in each of those four quadrants, whether they are typical or whether they have that behavior more than others or less than others. Everyone will receive a score in each quadrant on the sensory profile. The one that I just want to call out a little moment here is the registration quadrant, because you might have noticed already that the descriptor word, so we have seeking, seeker, avoiding, avoider, sensitivity, sensor, and then we have registration and bystander. So the descriptor word is quite different from the name of the quadrant itself. And that, I think, is partly to help explain what it might look like when you see someone who is a more than others in that quadrant. The same way all the other descriptors do, but the registration is a bit of an anomaly because when we're talking about the registration quadrant, we're actually talking about a continuum of not responding or not registering sensory input. In fact, in earlier iterations of this model, it was called the low registration quadrant. So if you think about it, if you have a high threshold, so you need more sensory input to notice, and you have a passive behavioural response, if you're in environments that are set up to meet the needs of people whose thresholds are a bit lower, then you are going to find that you are being understimulated, and because you have that passive behavioural response, you're not going to be seeking out the stimulation. So a lot of things are going to go on around you without you necessarily detecting them or really noticing them in any meaningful way, and that can leave you looking somewhat like a bystander in life. So that word there is to help you understand that when we're talking about registration, what we're really talking about is the continuum of not registering input, or another way to put that would be missing input. So it really is that quadrant is all about missing sensation. So you could also think about it in your own mind as being the missing quadrant. And therefore the descriptor would be a misser. I don't even know if that's a word. So bystander is a good word to use there. Let's take a look at each quadrant in more depth to really get an understanding of what those terms mean, but also what it might look like if someone has a more than others or a less than others score in each quadrant. And while these are quadrants, that the scores rather are linked to the sensory profile or the adolescent adult sensory profile, you don't have to have used the assessment tool to find this model useful and helpful in helping to understand what you're seeing when you observe behaviour and you're looking at it through a sensory lens. So if we're thinking about the registration quadrant, if we think about what a more than others would look like in that quadrant, remembering that this is also the continuum of missing sensory information. An example from the adolescent adult sensory profile is I don't smell things that other people say they smell. So we can see that this is something where sensory input is going on. Other people might be noticing it, but it's not intense enough to trip this person's thresholds, which sometimes would be a problem. For example, if your toast was burning, but in other situations could be a real strength. And I'm sure we can all think of times when we maybe would rather have not smelled that thing that we did smell. So one of the kind of outcomes of being a little bit of a bystander is that people who have more than other scores in registration are often quite easygoing. Winnie Dunn does call them sometimes the universal companions because they're usually happy to go with the flow. They are not too bothered by things. They'll just happily be a bit of a passenger and won't cause too much fuss. And so that's certainly not a bad thing, and in some cases can be a real strength. If we think about what a less than others would look like in this quadrant, then we just really flip the more than others definition. So someone who comes out as less than others in registration would tend to notice things that others would miss. So they might have an eye for really small, fine detail. I call this the Sherlock Holmes group because they are going to detect things that go undetected by most other people. Obviously a real strength if you are in fact a detective, or if you need to edit something, for example. But I guess the downside potentially of being less than others in this quadrant might be that you do get a little bit bogged down in fine detail and you almost don't see the wood for the trees. You might lose sight of the bigger picture. So hopefully what you are gathering from this is that there is no sort of right or wrong here. What we're more interested in is whether the person's sensory profile is actually a good fit for the situation that they're in. So let's take a look at the other quadrants as well. Moving on to the seeking quadrant. So again, we're in the high threshold still part of the framework here, but now we're at the active part of the self-regulation continuum. So this is also someone who has a very high need for sensation. They take a lot of input before it's enough for them, but rather than the registration or bystander group who don't tend to seek that out even though that they need it, the seekers are people who are driven as if by an engine in some ways to find that input that they need to satisfy their craving or their need for sensation. So a more than others person with a more than others score in this quadrant is going to be looking for ways to add sensory input to tasks or environments. And this is something that they do subconsciously. It's not something that they sit and plot and plan about. This is something that they find themselves doing a lot of the time without even necessarily realizing. But they may also do things to engineer their lives in a way that they can get extra sensation. And so one example from the adolescent adult sensory profile is I add spice to my food. And we all have that one friend who has to put the hot chili sauce on everything they eat, or that seeks out extremes of sensation in other ways. So that is an example of sensory seeking behavior. So some of the really good things about being a more than others in seeking are that these are people who tend to be curious, really engaged with life, interested in trying new sensory experiences. So again, not necessarily a bad thing at all. But if it gets to the point where it's disruptive and it's causing others to have adverse experiences, or it's affecting this person's ability to participate in needed activities because the seeking behavior goes over and above, then that is where it might become problematic. Something that's special about seeking is to also, when you see a more than other score in seeking, to just step back and ask yourself if there is a function or a purpose to that seeking behavior, because one of the things that we might end up seeing with seeking is that a person is using that seeking behavior as a way of trying to counteract or cope with something else that's bothering them, whether that's a sensory thing or whether it's something else. But we see that sort of seeking as a way of trying to self-calm, self-soothe. So when you do see more than others, it's always worth asking the question, do I think this is seeking for the sheer sake of seeking and the thrill of enjoying that sensory input? Or is there an underlying reason why this person is engaging in the seeking behavior? And that's where looking at the other parts of the framework can be helpful as well, particularly if you're seeing low threshold more than other scores. You might get a sense that some of that seeking at least is in response to something else that's bothering the person in a sensory fashion. A less than others score in seeking, again, it's really just the opposite. This is someone who doesn't really have a lot of interest in sensory experiences. They are not necessarily out there to experience life in all its wonderful different permutations and combinations, and they're comfortable in low stimulus environments. So even though they do have a high threshold and a high ability to tolerate sensory input, they are not out there trying to get more sensory input, and that can leave them looking sometimes quite amotivated. They might be described as a person who doesn't seem to have many interests, or it's hard to find something that motivates them. However, they will thrive in low stimulus environments because it's kind of meeting their needs. Moving now to the sensitivity quadrant, and you can see from the red circle there that we are now in the lower half of the framework, so the low threshold part of the framework. So sensitivity is a mix of low thresholds with a passive behavioural response, which means, again, if we think about the passive response being that the person is allowing the environment to control them, that this is someone who is kind of continually detecting sensory input to the point where it's kind of bombarding them and they're not doing anything to block that out. So there's a cumulative effect of all this sensory input, some of it relevant, some of it irrelevant, and a lack of ability to filter that out or to block it out, and potentially overwhelming this person over a period of time, or quite quickly if their thresholds are reached very, very soon. We also see in this quadrant that someone might have an unusually vivid or heightened response to sensation, and you can see the sample question there from the adolescent adult profile. I startle easily. So, for example, a noise that others might kind of momentarily pay attention to and then move on from. Someone who is a more than others in sensitivity might have a much longer, more of adrenaline type of reaction to that noise, and it might take them a long time to recover from that. Thinking specifically about people on the autism spectrum, there was a study published in 2020 in the Journal of Autism and Developmental Disorders where they did some EEG studies and showed that the autistic participants in the study took longer than their neurotypical peers to habituate to repetitive visual and auditory stimuli. And there's been other research that indicates that autistic students self-report experiencing particular difficulty with sound in the classroom. And another study I read that showed a correlation between the frequency of stimming behaviour and the decibel level in the classroom. So sensitivity can be a problem for anybody, but we know that we see quite a lot of people in that autistic community who struggle with it, and schools being those environments that are set up not specifically for someone with special sensory needs, they are susceptible to having difficulty there. If we think about a less than others response in this quadrant, or a less than others score in this quadrant, again, we just flip the definition of a more than others on its head, and we say this is someone who's likely to be very efficient at filtering out sensations, perhaps to the point where their focus is very narrow on just one type of stimulus. And so they're less likely to be distracted by extraneous input, which certainly in a classroom is a real strength, or in an open plan office, if that's where you work and you need to get your work done with other things going on around you. But potentially could mean that if you were in a situation where you did need to focus on multiple stimuli at the same time, for example, if you were a teacher working in a classroom, then that may be a problem for you. And I'm speaking from personal experience here, because I also am less than others in the sensitivity quadrant, and helps to illustrate to me one reason why I probably gravitated towards occupational therapy rather than teaching, because with OT you're much more likely to be focused on one child at a time as opposed to however many are in a classroom. And I certainly take my hat off to all those classroom teachers and anyone who deals with more than one child at the same time. Our last quadrant is the avoiding quadrant. So this is where we have a low threshold to sensory input and an active or counteracting response to that low threshold, so that if this person starts to feel overwhelmed by sensory stimulation, they will definitely take action to try and limit that sensory stimulation. And that can look like fight or flight often, so withdrawing from the overwhelming input, taking themselves away, the flight response, or sometimes trying to actively stop it, and sometimes that will end up being more like a fight response. An example from the sensory profile is I only eat familiar foods. Best case scenario for someone with a more than others score in avoiding is that they will never become overwhelmed by sensory input, and the way that they can kind of try and ensure that happens is by having a lot of familiarity, a lot of sameness in their lives, where things are done the same way, the routines are stuck to. They might have specific foods that they like to eat all the time, or specific rituals about how to do things. They might only associate with a select group of people who they feel safe with, who they know aren't going to do anything unexpected. So they need that control and that familiarity to feel safe and comfortable. It's probably not difficult to imagine how that could be problematic for someone, particularly again if they're in an environment that was set up to cater for the needs of most rather than for them specifically. But again, can also be a strength. I mean, people who stick to the plan and don't deviate from the plan, and who like everything to be the same all the time, there's certainly a place for that, and certain situations where that is a real strength. If we are less than others in avoiding, again, we are opposite to that. We thrive on spontaneity, change, lack of routine is perfect. This is what this person really feels comfortable with. I can again talk about personal experience of this, because I am also a less than others in avoiding. And when I did my sensory profile, I figured that I would come out as a more than others in seeking, because I do like to get out and experience life. But actually, it makes more sense for me to be less than others in avoiding, because I do like spontaneity and change, and I don't like things to be too samey, but at the same time, I don't necessarily need the intensity and the frequency of sensory stimulation that are more than others in seeking would need. So it's a quite a fine distinction to make. But the really important thing to remember is, if you see these more than others and less than others scores, it's what it means for that individual person, rather than trying to necessarily explain it on a very theoretical level. So less than others, obviously the strength, I guess, of that is that ability to be spontaneous and not need things to be routine and sameness and that sameness. But by the same token, some things actually do need to be avoided and are unsafe. And so this person is, I guess, at risk of maybe not recognizing that, maybe until it's too late. Now that we've briefly looked at the 4 quadrants of Dunn's sensory processing framework, let's take a look at the tools that we can use to actually measure someone's sensory profile and find out where they do score in each of those 4 quadrants. And so the 2 standardized measures Winnie Dunn has authored, one of them she's co-authored. The first is the sensory profile 2, and the second is the adolescent adult sensory profile. So let's take a look at both of those tools. The Sensory Profile 2 was published in 2014. It's a standardized questionnaire that's designed to be filled out by a caregiver or a teacher. So there are different versions of the form, but the ages are birth to 14 years, 11 months. So we're talking about younger people, often who are too young to self-report. So we have an infant form, which is from birth to 6 months, a toddler form, which is 7 to 35 months. The child form is 3 to 14 years, 11 months, and there's also a short version of that. So that's more of a screening or a research version. And then the school form is designed to be filled out by someone who knows the child at school. So it's often the child's teacher, or it might be an aide or someone else who knows the child pretty well at school. And so the questions that are on the sensory profile are really asking about everyday sensory experiences in either the environment of school, a school classroom, or home and the wider community. The adolescent adult sensory profile was co-authored by Winnie Dunn and Katana Brown, and is also a standardized sensory processing questionnaire, but this one is designed as a self-report measure, and you can see the age range there is 11 through to 65 plus. So we do have an overlap between the age ranges for the adolescent adult profile and the sensory profile 2 rather. So if you have someone who's aged between 11 and 15, you could make a call as to which version you wanted to use. Bear in mind that the questions on the adolescent adult sensory profile do assume that the person is functioning pretty much at their chronological age. So if you have someone who's functioning developmentally younger than their chronological age, then the sensory profile 2 is probably a better choice. But again, the nature of the questions is that it's asking about sensory experiences in the types of activities and environments that someone in this age range would find themselves in. And both of these tools give you scores for each of those 4 quadrants in the framework, as well as the sensory profile 2 gives you scores for individual sensory systems as well. You don't get that with the adolescent adult sensory profile, but there are ways of analysing the data so that you can identify patterns of response for each different sensory system. Usually when we administer a standardized assessment, we're interested in looking at the scores, and particularly the low scores, which are the areas where we feel we want to base our remediation, or that will help us explain the difficulties that the person is having in their life. It doesn't work like that with a sensory profile. There's no right or wrong sensory profile. And as I briefly said before, it functions more like a personality measure. You wouldn't administer a personality measure expecting to get a percentile rank, for example. It's the same thing with the sensory profile. We want to, rather than label them or diagnose them with anything, we want to just gain a holistic picture of them, find out their sensory preferences so that we can understand the level of fit between those sensory preferences and what they're actually getting from their environment, which can then help us to understand maybe some of the barriers to participation. So the sensory profile is not designed as an outcome measure. We're not expecting to see someone's sensory profile change in response to our intervention, and we're not seeking to try and fix them. This is really just so that we get a better understanding of their needs and incorporate that with other assessments that we might do to help us form our overall intervention plan. So bearing in mind that a lot of people attending today work within the school environment, we're going to look at implications of sensory processing differences for participation at school, as well as some interventions to assist. But these implications and interventions can apply to other settings outside of school as well. It's you can take the principles with you and apply them to any environment, really. So when we're thinking about how someone's sensory processing patterns might affect their participation in the school environment, we need to be thinking about various aspects. So we want to think about the physical environment itself, like the design of the building and what the materials are that it's made of and how that might affect things like the acoustics. The social environment, so the social environment includes the teacher and any other adults in the environment with the student, as well as the other students. And task demands. So what are the sensory aspects of the various tasks that the child will engage in throughout the school day? So if we think about the way that different sensory processing patterns might be challenging for participation, I think it's useful to think about high threshold versus low threshold. So if we see someone who has a more than others score in the registration quadrant or the seeking quadrant or both quadrants, then we know that this is someone who needs more stimulation than most others in order to feel that that is enough. And so in environments that were set up to meet the needs of the majority rather than these more outliers, this is someone who's going to be at risk of understimulation at various times throughout the day, including things like having to be seated for long periods of time. If you are someone who needs a lot of motor stimulation, then that might be problematic for you at school. We know a lot of teachers use a lot of verbal instruction, so they might use that auditory channel when they're teaching. So if you have a high threshold to auditory input, it may mean that you miss out on some of that important information that the teacher is trying to tell you. Likewise with visual, if you're not very if you have a high threshold to visual input, then you may not be very good at picking up on social cues, those non-verbal cues. And we know that when we have autistic individuals, that social skills are often very difficult for them. And one of the contributors to that may be that visually they are not that adept at picking up on those social cues because of a generalized higher threshold to visual input. There's also at school often limited opportunities to gain additional stimulation because classrooms, timetables are set up and class environments are set up, again, to meet the needs of most rather than all. And so if the child does engage in seeking behaviours, then that can lead them to being labelled as being disruptive, or they might be seen to be very, very distractible. When in fact what they're trying to do is just meet their sensory needs. We also know that people who are on the autism spectrum often say that they have difficulty processing multiple stimuli at the same time. So they might say, I'm fine to focus on something visual, but don't try and talk to me at the same time. Or they might have trouble switching between different sensory modalities. So again, in a classroom environment where there might be children might be expected to listen and look at the same time, that may pose a problem for a student who's got autism, which would then affect their participation because they might miss instructions, or they might not be able to learn the information effectively that's being taught to them. I think it's also important to acknowledge, though, that having these more than other scores is not always a bad thing. It's not always a barrier to participation. So I just want to quickly highlight some strengths as well. So if we were to think about how having a high threshold is how that can give someone a superpower, then in the case of a school environment, that tolerance for input becomes a superpower, because we know that schools can be very, very stimulating environments from a sensory perspective. There can be a lot of things going on at once, particularly when you have whole school or whole class environments where there might be lots of people in the same space. There might be lots of different visual stuff going on with displays hanging from walls and ceilings. There might be certainly olfactory or smell stimuli, which we see when we see a lot of people in the same space, in a small space. So this is something that is less likely to bother someone who has a high threshold to input. And we know, we've said before, that seekers tend to be enthusiastic and curious and really engaged in experiencing lots of new things in life. And we know that the bystanders are less likely to be disruptive. They are quite easygoing, and they tend to, within a group environment, not be the one that's causing a lot of problems. Something else to remember is that when you do have seeking behaviour, that sometimes it's very functional. Sometimes that seeking behaviour, although it might look a bit strange, is the thing that is actually keeping that student within that classroom. So, we talk about stimming with kids who have autism, and sometimes we have parents who say, I don't like it when they do that. It makes them look strange, it makes them look different. And it's important to remember that sometimes that stimming is actually that real adaptive response that they have to their differences in sensory needs. And so we want to be very careful about trying to take that away from them, because it might be the very thing that's actually keeping them able to be in that environment with those other students. So anytime we see seeking behaviour, as I said before, we can ask ourselves what the function of it is, but also, even if we do see seeking behaviour that's not overly helpful in a social sense, it can at least give us a clue as to what the child is needing so that we can find alternatives. In terms of interventions for when you do see a mismatch between someone's sensory thresholds and the sensory stimulation they're getting from their environments or from tasks that they're doing, it's really difficult in a webinar like this to give you like a laundry list of specific interventions to try, because it's going to be very individual, not only to the person and their own sensory patterns, but to the situations where you are being called on to help. So I think it's more useful to just think about principles for intervention. There are some intervention strategies listed in the back of both the SP2 and the Adolescent Adult Sensory Profile manuals. A lot of the time it's just being really creative and thinking about ways to try and meet that gap that exists between the person's thresholds and what they're actually getting. So in the terms of high threshold, obviously what we're trying to do is find ways to build more sensory input into that person's day so that they don't have to seek it out over and above what they're already getting. Or in the case of registration, thinking about ways of making sensory input more salient so that they are able to find the things that they need rather than missing that needed information. And these strategies are taken from an infographic that's available to download from the Pearson website. So I'm not going to sit and read them all out. You have them on your handout. But just thinking about taking those principles and turning them into actual strategies is, as I said, probably more useful than just giving you a list of things to try that may or may not be relevant for the students that you're working with. If we think about how having a low threshold to sensory stimulation might present participation challenges, we're now, of course, thinking about being at risk of overstimulation in environments that are set up to meet the needs of most rather than people who are more outliers in that framework. And so we know that in a school environment, when we have students who have low thresholds, so either sensitivity patterns or avoiding patterns or both, that they may have difficulty with change or novelty. So anytime there's a change in routine, maybe a substitute teacher or a change in the timetable, or even if the classroom has been changed around and a new display has been put up or they moved to a different seat in the classroom, those things might be difficult for them. They may have fight or flight responses, as we talked about before with the avoiders, to certain environments, and they may be a bit of a flight risk from the classroom, or they may tend to have even an aggressive response to certain types of stimulation, which can quickly see them labelled as a bit of a troublemaker. They may be seen as distractible and have difficulty completing work on time because they have difficulty focusing on that one piece of work and ignoring other extraneous stimuli around them. And particularly in the avoiding quadrant, that need for control, that need to be the one calling the shots so that you can control how much sensory input is coming into your world, can certainly have an impact on social abilities if you're the one who's always needs to be in charge of the game and choosing where you play, for example, or what the game is going to be and who you play with. May see you other kids seeing you as bossy or too controlling or not much fun to be around. And as I said, in one size fits most environments like schools, but also a lot of other places where people spend their time that weren't designed specifically by them, this is where we're more likely to see a mismatch and see this overstimulation when we have low thresholds. But also, as we did with high threshold, acknowledging that sometimes having a low threshold can be advantageous. So in this case, the superpower is heightened awareness to sensation, which means that if you have a low threshold, then you may tend to excel at sort of creative arts types of activities, painting, or in terms of a school subject, art in general, music, anything where that intense experience of sensation is likely to give you a bit of an edge over others. And we know that some research shows that autistic individuals can show enhanced visual processing, particularly in visual search tasks. So those might be areas that they excel within the school environment. They also might be aware of subtle changes and be observant of subtle changes, and that may be a strength depending on the task. And will likely respond well to sameness and routine, which are generally features of most school environments, certainly routine. And they may tend to work well in self-directed or solitary activities. And we know during the pandemic, when people were locked down and students were studying from home, sometimes sometimes students really thrived on that because they were able to be much more solitary and have environments set up much more to meet their needs, while other peers really struggle with that lack of social contact. So again, it's very dependent on the environment and the situation as to whether that then becomes a good match for your sensory profile or not such a good match. Here are the principles for intervention for low thresholds from that infographic. So obviously one of the goals with low threshold is to make sure that the person isn't going to be overwhelmed by sensory input. So just being aware of where input is coming in to their world and finding a way to structure their environment so that there's not too much novelty, not too much chance for them to become overwhelmed and bombarded, and giving them a chance to be in control as much as possible, which can be challenging in a school environment. Although I don't want to send you off with a list of sensory strategies or activities, because I don't think that's helpful, because they need to be very individually tailored. Here are just some common sensory supports that we do see put in place in schools. So you have this on your handout. As I said, it's not an exhaustive list, but it might help you to start off in the right direction when you're thinking about potential sensory supports that you could put in place with the students that you work with. So of course the big question is, what about when you have a sensory profile where all 4 quadrants are showing atypical scores? Particularly they tend to be more than other scores. It's all very well to have these principles for intervention for high threshold and low threshold, but what about when you have a mix of them and it seems like everything is elevated? Well, the answer to that is to remember that the sensory profile is not designed to label or to judge, to say that someone is above or below average. And so we can't use the scores on the sensory profile alone to determine what our intervention is going to be. The scores by themselves are not actually that meaningful. You need to interpret in context. It's really not uncommon, particularly when you're working with people with autism, to see a score profile where all the quadrants show a difference. So what you need to do is, rather than expect the sensory profile scores to tell you what the person's difficulties are to then base your intervention, you need to start at the other end and say, these are the difficulties that I know that they're already having, and then use those difficulties to form a hypothesis about where you think the sensory mismatch is, and then use the sensory profile to test that hypothesis. And it may be that even though all 4 quadrants are atypical, there's one quadrant in particular, one sensory system in particular, that is the major contributor to that particular difficulty that you're working on. And so that is where you're going to base your intervention. And your interventions need to be very specifically linked to that goal or that problem. Otherwise, they're not going to work, and then you're not going to get a lot of buy-in from the teacher or the student or the parent or whoever it is that you're working with. A lot of you have probably already seen this quote. It certainly does the rounds on Facebook from time to time. Everyone is a genius, but if you judge a fish by its ability to climb a tree, it will live its whole life believing that it is stupid. It's commonly attributed to Einstein, although there is some contention about whether it's actually Einstein's quote or not. But regardless, I think it's really applicable when you are thinking about anyone with sensory processing differences, but obviously the focus of this webinar is autism. If you are going to judge someone by a certain set of standards that they can't meet, it sort of belies the fact that they may have strengths in other areas. And so that is really one of the founding principles of the sensory profile, and one that we would encourage you to take forward when you are working with individuals with autism and looking at their sensory needs. Winnie Dunn is a big advocate of using a strengths-based approach to intervention, where you, instead of looking at trying to fix someone using that deficit-based model, you're instead looking at how their unique differences can actually be a strength, and building on those and trying to tailor environments so that they will help you capitalize on those strengths. It's an approach that encourages self-advocacy and improves self-determination, and is really a very positive way of looking at doing your intervention. So it fits really nicely with this idea that there is no right or wrong sensory profile. What we are trying to do, in fact, is, rather than changing the person, is trying to make sure there's a better match between the person, their sensory needs, the sensory aspects of tasks and environments, so that we can make the most of those unique attributes that they have, while minimizing the negative effects, perhaps, of those attributes. A quick Google Scholar search will reveal lots and lots and lots of research involving sensory processing, and quite a lot of it also involving sensory processing and autism. So I just wanted to give you a snapshot of some articles that I had read that I thought would be of interest to the people tuning in today. The first study that I wanted to talk about was published in 2021, and it was looking at executive functioning as a possible mediator between sensory processing and behavior in autism spectrum disorder. And I was quite interested in this topic because I do think that when someone has good executive functioning skills, they're able to do a lot of their own problem solving, so that even if their sensory preferences are not well matched by the sensory environment and task, they're able to find a way through. The study, you can see the summary of it there, so I'm not going to read out each bullet point, but they use the child behavior checklist as their executive functioning measure, and they found that emotion regulation and control had the biggest link to behavior and sensory processing, unsurprisingly. So they describe emotion regulation and control as a children's ability to control their emotional reactions, impulses, and self-injurious behavior, which are a key factor in social competencies. The kind of missed opportunity I feel about this study is that they were looking at linking that emotional control and emotional regulation and control with specific sensory systems, like touch and auditory, etc., rather than the quadrant patterns, which I think probably would have given a lot more interesting data. They also were a little bit limited on which aspects of executive functioning they were looking at. So they looked at planning, working memory, and then emotional regulation and control, and didn't find really much in the way of mediating effects of working memory or planning. So the study was, a lot of the discussion was around that emotional regulation and control, which, whilst backed up probably what you could already hypothesize, didn't shed as much light as I would have probably liked it to on the role of executive functioning in helping a person kind of put themselves between the stimulus and the response. Nevertheless, it was an interesting article to read, and there's a link there if you want to check it out for yourself. The next article I'm going to talk about was a review of a number of behavioural and neurobiological studies on social and sensory processing in autism spectrum disorder to explore the relationship between the two. One of the things that was interesting was that they noted that sensory atypicalities are one of the earliest emerging markers of infants later diagnosed with ASD. So they even talked about at 6 months being able to identify sensory differences that then those infants turned out later to have a diagnosis of ASD. They noted some other aspects that you can see in the bullet points there, but I think the takeaways of this paper for me were a general recommendation that sensory issues, which may differ across individuals on the autism spectrum, take an important role in social and communicative difficulties in ASD, and hence need to be considered when designing intervention for children with autism spectrum disorders. So just another reminder to us to definitely consider sensory issues as part of a holistic approach when working with people who are on the spectrum. So this research was looking at sensory processing patterns amongst a sample of children with autism, ADHD, as well as typical development. And you can see there was a cohort of researchers, including Winnie Dunn, who completed this research with 239 individuals, of which 77 had autism spectrum disorders, 78 had ADHD, and 84 were typically developing. And there's some really interesting findings. So both the ASD and ADHD groups had higher scores on the SP2 than typically developing, but among them there was no distinctive diagnostic profile. So there wasn't an ADHD profile versus an ASD profile. There were some individual differences. So you can see there the ASD group showed the highest rate of oral processing differences, but the ADHD group had more visual processing differences. So the kind of takeaway from this research was that when we are working with children who have ASD or ADHD, sometimes both, that we know that sensory features can be a part of those, which has implications for, again, the way that we intervene with both of these groups. This next study also involves some of the same researchers as the previous study that I mentioned, and it's a little bit older, but it's really, really fascinating. This was looking at classifying sensory profiles of children in the general population. So they had children both with and without developmental conditions and looked at their sensory processing patterns. So they used the sensory profile 2, and you can see they had a large sample there, of which about 70% were typically developing, and then the remainder had various conditions, including autism spectrum disorder, ADHD, and learning difficulties. There was also a gifted sample in there as well, a small number, I think there were 15. And what they found was basically 5 distinct profiles or score patterns amongst this whole sample. So the first one they called the balanced, which is just a typical score on all 4 quadrants. And unsurprisingly, 88% of the typically developing children fell into this category, and that was 79% of the total sample. But the thing that's really interesting is that 35% of the children in the autism sample also fell into this profile. So we do talk about sensory differences in autism a lot, but it's not a done deal. So you can have children who have autism who don't have any sensory atypicalities at all. And that number was higher certainly than I had expected. Profile 2 they called the interested profile, which was this group had higher scores in the seeking quadrant, and one of the features of this group was that they tended to be younger children. That was the main takeaway out of this one. But you can see that only 6% of the typically developing children and 9% of the autism sample came under this profile. Profile 3 they called intense. So this was one where all the quadrants scored as more than others. And you can see it's only 5% of the total sample and 2% of the typically developing sample, but a much bigger number, nearly 20% of the ASD sample came out as the intense profile. Profile 4, they called mellow and till. So this was children who had higher scores on both the registration and avoiding quadrants, which can seem kind of almost opposites when you think about where they sit in the model. But the idea was that they were mellow, the registration part, until maybe something got to the point where it was so much for them that they then turned into avoiders and showed those avoiding type of responses. It's like they didn't notice that they were being overstimulated until it was too late. So that was, again, a small number of the sample, but a much bigger group in the autism sample than in the typically developing sample. And then profile 5, they called the vigilant group, who had higher scores in the low threshold quadrant, so sensitivity and avoiding. And you can see it's a very small percentage of the typically developing children, but nearly a quarter of the children on the spectrum. So again, that fits with really everything else that we've talked about in this webinar today. So some takeaways are that children with and without diagnoses presented across all the subtypes, that one subtype was significantly younger in age, and that atypical sensory processing patterns are not unique to children with autism or any other developmental disabilities, but are rather just reflections of children's abilities to respond to environmental demands, and also that sensory diversity is part of the human condition. We don't expect everybody to be the same. This was another really fascinating study that was used a small sample, but this was really talking about the lived experience of sensory differences with children in a classroom who had autism spectrum disorder. So they used the adolescent adult sensory profile, and the most interesting things that I found about this were the things that they were reporting being bothersome for them in the classroom. So hearing, you can see, was most commonly reported as the area of difficulty, followed by touch, vision, and smell, and that their sensory sensitivities affected their concentration and therefore their learning. And they used words like feeling anxious, uncomfortable, frustrated, annoyed, and expressing physical discomfort as a result of sensory mismatches. So again, I would encourage you to check that article out if you are interested in reading a little bit more about that research. So the last study I wanted to mention was looking at sensory processing in low functioning adults with autism spectrum disorder. I wanted to talk about this one because I'm conscious that there are people listening today who probably do work with adults, and we've been quite heavy on our child content. So just wanted to mention this one because, again, it was quite interesting. They used the adolescent adult sensory profile, but it was completed by a proxy, so someone who worked with the person who had knew them very, very well. They found that the ASD group showed more low registration, more than other scores in low registration, and less seeking, sensitivity, and avoiding than the controls, which was an interesting result that was probably a little bit unexpected. I guess the takeaways of this research are that there is a high prevalence of sensory differences in this population, which highlights the need to consider sensory processing as part of the overall assessment of these individuals, and to think about undersensitivity, that people may be using self-aggression as a form of self-stimulation, that these behaviours could potentially be discouraged by implementing sensory modulation approaches. And there's an occupational therapist in the States named Tina Champagne who does a lot of work in this area and has a lot of good resources. And also to just remember that when you do have people who are quite low functioning, they're particularly vulnerable to sensory mismatches because their low levels of autonomy limit their ability to develop their own coping strategies. So some key takeaways here are, first of all, that sensory differences are prevalent in children, adults and adolescents with ASD. And the key when we're working with these individuals is to help identify what their sensory preferences are so that we can then better identify how well those sensory needs are being met, and to employ a strengths-based perspective when we're working with these individuals. And remember that sensory diversity makes the world go round. We don't expect everyone to be the same, and we need to honour individual differences and make sure that we are not trying to fix people. Maybe if you are using the sensory profile or considering using the sensory profile, we do find a lot of people find it quite a complex test to use, and so we have developed a training module that you can do. It's an on-demand, you can do it in your own time. If you want some more information about that, you can visit the Pearson website at the training link that's provided there to find out more and to purchase that training.
Wonderful. Thank you, Melinda, and thank you everybody for joining today. I know we've run over by 3 minutes, but I hope you found that it worth staying on for the extra 3 minutes at the end. I know there were some fascinating studies. If you had any questions that weren't answered, if you can, there'll be a pop-up box once the session has closed. If you could add your question in there, and we'll make sure that somebody follows up with you. And to say this recording will be available on our website in a few days' time. So if you know somebody that missed it and they want to be able to access it, they will be able to do so then. They just won't get the CEs after the event. So yeah, just to wish everybody a great day, and thank you very much for joining us today. Enjoy the rest of your day. Thanks. Bye-bye.